Okay. So today we're going to talk about direct marketing produce. So this is going to include folks who have on-farm stands, farmers markets, CSAs. Generally, the folks that are direct marketing are under 50 acres, but sometimes they get up to 150 acres or even a little bit more. So we're going to talk about um, a lot of this is going to end up being hand labor. So smaller farmers tend not to be as mechanized, especially when you have diversified crops. So you can't really go and find a piece of equipment that's only going to and pay for it that's going to pick 2 rows of carrots. You have 50 different things. You can't have a machine for everything. So that's a lot of what we're going to be discussing today. So I'll introduce myself. So in addition to this, my job as an extension agent, um, we do have a 40-acre vegetable farm. We have farm on site, and then we have some land that we rent in other places to try to minimize our risk. So it's at different elevations and different soils and things like that. My husband has been farming for at this location for 35 years, but comes from a family that grew vegetables on the side. So he can tell me stories about being at the farmer's market when he was 5. And back then, that's the kind of thing that you did because you had 10 kids and one person working, and you had to do something a little bit extra to make sure everybody had enough to eat. On our particular vegetable farm, we grow over 50 different crops. Um, Almost everything is done by either hand labor or tractor, small scale tractor. Uh, a lot of the very small farms, so we're talking about a few acres, will be doing everything through hand labor or small pieces of equipment. Um, we sell primarily at farmers markets and at farm stands. We're located in the Mukwonago area. We sell in the Milwaukee, Waukesha, Racine counties for farmers markets. Um, and then we do have the addition of having part-time and seasonal workers. So trying to coach them on how to do things ergonomically and efficiently is something that we do constantly, especially since most of farm laborers are short-term labor. They don't tend to make a career out of it. So you're lucky to have somebody come back 2 or 3 years in a row. So it's a constant teaching process. This is just an overview timeline of what we're doing on the farm throughout the year. We will start growing plants as early as February 15th. I always joke with my husband that it's our Valentine's Day tradition to start onions on Valentine's Day. So we will be starting with seeding and things like that as early as middle of February. Um, and I'll go into each of these in a little more detail with individual slides. We're in the greenhouses pretty much almost exclusively until we get to April and things start to thaw. Then we're kind of greenhouse and field, still taking care of plants and then planting things and taking care of weeds and things like that. So you're doing kind of both ends of it. Once we get May through November, it's mostly growing things and selling them, or at least trying to sell them. And then July through November, we also have quite a bit of field work that's going on to make sure that we do have things to sell. And then during the winter, when everybody thinks we're kind of off, kicking our heels up, is when you clean, fix, plan, shop, and you do all the paperwork. So it is a little bit slower season, but it goes from maybe like 80 to 100 hours a week down to about 40 to 50 hours a week. So this is not the kind of job that has a lot of downtime. So most of the folks that are working it are really using their bodies and really putting a lot into it. So in the spring, we start with greenhouse. There's quite a bit to do to get greenhouses set up. If you have we call the plastic covered ones usually hoop houses. So a lot of growers will have hoop houses and grow their own plants because it's a lot more efficient and you have a lot more control. Uh, besides instead of ordering transplants. So the things that we need to do to set up our greenhouse for production is we have to move all of our hoses, everything gets stored away for the winter. Um, so we carry all those hoses, we set them up for irrigation. So we lift and arrange the benches. Most people's hoop houses are kind of flex space. So you have to have stuff that moves from here to there and things that you can change up. So we usually have tractors or something else in the hoop house during the off season. And we have to go and remove all the stuff that we've been storing in there and move in all the benches and set those up. One of the things that we're doing is seeding and transplanting. So seeding when if you see the kind of lower right-hand picture, you can see all those trays and all those plants in there. So we spend days upon days seeding things, and many of the crops that we have to seed in just those large general trays, and then they have to get transferred to um, little cups, so little individual plants, and most of our trays have 64 of them in there. So you'll be pulling out one plant and making a little hole and sticking it in there and covering it up. We spend many, many days doing this. It does get very monotonous. Uh, in addition to that, we are watering everything, making sure that we're keeping things watered and trying to manage temperature to the extent that we can, although heating is not something that's real cost effective, so it's really kind of minimal. Once we start growing the plants in the greenhouse, we need to go in there and weed and thin seedlings. So a lot of that is kind of like looking around, bending over, that kind of a thing. We have disease and insect management, trying to look at plants that don't look right, trying to either pull them out or look for bugs or all sorts of stuff like that. And then we have to manage the temperature and humidity, which can be actually pretty tricky because between February and April, you can go from anywhere in the mid 30s to 100 plus degrees in the greenhouse. It heats up quick. It can be very warm. So we try to make sure that we can not just keep the plants comfortable, but we can keep our folks comfortable too. So there's a lot of things that we do to try to manage that. But of course, because we're all small operations, we try to do that kind of on the cheap. So there's a wide range of temperatures we feel are acceptable for doing greenhouse work. Um, and to be honest, if it gets too hot in the greenhouse, we'll just move a table outside and get a little more breeze that way. So once we move out of the field or out of the greenhouse, we need to take all of those transplants and all of those plants out into the field. So we have to pick up all those trays out of the greenhouse. We have to walk them. We put them on a truck and take the truck out into the field. And then in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see somebody on a small scale planter. So a lot of times, many people plant by hand. Um, so that's one thing to think about. Are people using a seed planter like the gentleman in the red shorts on the upper right, where he can push that and the seeds or the plants go in? The other option is a mechanical planter you pull behind a tractor, and basically you have somebody who sits on the back of that and pulls a plant and puts it into the ground. Um, I the trick with some of the okay, and then we'll do the lower left hand, which is somebody digging the holes and putting the plants in by hand. These are all very common ways to do it, and sometimes it differs by crop. But what I can say is that regardless of what you're doing during field planting, it's going to be unbelievably redundant. Um, and it's very physical work. So even if you're sitting down on a planter, you're grabbing, you're twisting, you're putting something someplace. So and then constantly looking behind you to make sure that things are um, going where they're supposed to be. So even in the things when you're sitting down and you think that there's not a lot of physical activity there, there really is. You've got to use, a lot of different parts of your body when you're doing these things. And you're doing a lot of things repetitively. Um, Other things that we're doing is pulling plants, lifting stuff and loading trucks, tractor driving, which is another really strangely physical thing to do. You've got a clutch and you've got brakes, and you're constantly turning around trying to communicate with the people behind you, and you have to monitor speed and things like that. So it's not something like you're sitting there just looking forward like you're driving a car. It's um, you're turning around a lot. You're trying to hear people. And then irrigation and laying plastic and row cover. This can be especially difficult, especially if you have long rows. Laying plastic, they're very long pieces. Plastic can be very heavy. Irrigation tape can be difficult to lay out. A lot of the plastic that you put down, you have to make holes in for the plants. So that's another thing that has to be done. So these are all very um, physical things you're doing, and you're doing them all outside in good, bad, and otherwise weather. So once we have everything in the ground, and that's not like it's not a finite thing. Different crops will grow at different temperatures, so we always have to, it's all staggered. So we'll go through probably in May and June is the height of planting, but there'll still be planting being done later in the year. Um, But the biggest thing we worry about once the plants are in the field are trying to manage weeds, because weed management, you got to keep the crops growing faster than the weeds are growing. Um, as you see in the picture, there are several different ways to do that. Um, the trick is that once you get plants in the ground, most of what you can do for weed control is manual. You can't just use weed killers to do it, because most of the weeds that need to be killed are broadleaf plants, and so are the things that you're growing. So you can't selectively just kill the weeds in your tomato crop field. So the options for that go anywhere from using a hoe and just hoeing it out. Um, the the one on the top right is a cultivating tractor. So, but as you can see, this guy has to constantly watch where those cultivators are, because um, you don't want to run over your crop. So he's going to spend hours like in this kind of odd position where he's turned around and looking down, and still trying to operate the tractor. Hand weeding is also an option. Um, Lots of different ways people accomplish that, usually however it feels best for them, but it's bending over or kneeling down, or um, all sorts of different things that people try to do to try to vary the way their bodies doing that so they don't get too sore. Um, Fertilization, that can be done by hand. It can be done by tractor. Staking and trellising. Staking is probably one of the more physically challenging things that we do, because we have to actually physically um, take the stake and beat it down into the ground, probably at least 2 feet, because of the winds, and you want to make sure that that stake is going to be stable and not go anywhere. So if you have a couple of acres and you're putting in a stake every 24 inches, usually it takes us 2 to 3 days of just putting in stakes. Always compounded if the grass or the ground is dry. Usually we try to pick that window, but if there's anything that isn't consistent about farming, it's the weather. So you kind of got to deal with whatever you got to deal with. Um, Growing, there's also pesticide applications. Those can be done with a backpack sprayer, or a tractor or something attached to your tractor. And then we have pest protection, which is similar. So you're going to be dealing with that, but you also may be dealing with things like row cover that you have to carry and pull the length of your row and then cover it up, and then you might be covering and uncovering every single day during the early time of the season to prevent things like flea beetle. without pesticides. So depending on how you farm, it may be more labor or less labor intensive. So once we actually get stuff growing and we have to harvest it and we start getting ready to sell, um, so for us, we sell mostly vegetable plants and herbs in the early part of the year. It's usually end of June when we start having crops that are available, things like zucchini and kohlrabi and other early season crops. So the picking takes place by hand. So folks go out with whatever they're picking into. You see a couple of different examples here. Often it's crates, sometimes it's wheelbarrows. Um, but folks are going to go out with their container and they're going to pick things into it and then they're going to load it on something. So it might be a truck, it might be a trailer, um, but they're basically going to have to carry what they're picking over to someplace else. Often folks end up um, holding their container and picking into it at the same time. So there's a lot of picking that up and putting it down, cutting something, harvesting a few, heads of broccoli, and then putting it back, picking it back up and moving it down the row. So then carrying it, generally, because of the row spacing, you can only, if you're using a truck to carry it back to your barn, you can only put that at the far end of each row. It's unusual to have your trucks in the rows just because of plant damage and because of the way the rows are spaced. It's usually not accommodating any kind of tires. Sometimes you can have a tractor in there for things that will help you along the way. And of course, we have a substantial number of plain faith growers that use horse in the field. And then once you once you pick the stuff, you're moving it a lot. So you basically move it from the field to a truck, from the truck to maybe a cooler or a storage area. Um, you might be putting it through a washer and you have to go move it over to the washer and wash it and clean it and put it back in a crate. And then it goes back in the cooler, it goes back into a storage area, and then it'll have to go onto a truck. Um, if you are selling at farmers markets, you always have the joy of taking it off the truck and putting it back onto the truck if you don't sell it. So there's a lot of picking up and moving and lifting of stuff. Some of it can be decently light, but you can also have a crate like that full of potatoes, which is not in any way light. So we talked about carrying and moving. We also have things like knives and other kinds of harvest equipment. You can see the gentleman in the upper left harvesting broccoli. And basically what he's going to do is he's going to put his hand on the top of the head and he's going to take a knife and he's going to chop it off. Um, some produce is easier to pick than others. A tomato you can just pick off, but think about something like Brussels sprouts where it grows as a 3-foot stalk and you have to bend that. You have to knock all the leaves off. You have to bend that Brussels sprout, and then we at our farm use saw to actually cut through because that's a pretty difficult thing. So that's a really labor intensive one. Other things that can be really tricky when you're picking are things like watermelons and pumpkins, things that are large and you have to get down and pick them up off the ground and put them into wherever you're storing them. Um, and then another step on all of this is curing and storing. So if you have things like potatoes or onions or other things that you're going to hold and continue to sell. Sometimes there's another step, like for garlic or onions and things like that, where you're going to have to actually dry it and cure it before it goes into storage. So lifting and carrying, there are a lot of ways to do this. There are a lot of right and wrong ways to do this. People tend to just decide how they're going to do it and keep doing it. But we try to help people think about what they're doing and how they're carrying things and lifting from their knees and things like that. But lifting and carrying is a substantial part of the job, and you might be lifting. You can see all the different ways people are lifting stuff. That tote of cabbages has to be fairly um, heavy right there. Strawberries might be lighter. Um, she's working on a raised bed, so that might be easier. But regardless of what you're doing, lifting and carrying is a substantial amount of the work that you do as a fresh market grower. So selling, in a way, this is a break, and in a way, it's not. So you have to load and unload the truck. So that's usually a heavy job. Trucks, you might be unloading a truck that is closer to ground level. You might have a little ramp on your truck, or you might have a truck that's taller and somebody's pushing the produce out to you, and you grab it off the tailgate and you carry it over someplace. So the trick with that is generally we're trying to do that on a fairly quickly. You only get so much time to set up at a farmer's market. Um, so that can be something that has to be done quickly. Reloading the truck, if you have another farmer's market like our farm in the afternoon, we unload it in the morning, we sell, we reload it, we go to another farmer's market in the afternoon on Saturday, unload it, and then reload it again. So that's a lot. Uh, Not everybody on our staff can lift really well. So that can be a tricky thing, especially if there's only one or two people that are doing it at two different markets. We also have tables, tents, and displays to set up. Um, I mean, there are ways to try to accommodate this, but the common thing to use if tables aren't provided or benches aren't provided is an 8 foot long collapsible table, so you can fit it on the truck and pop the legs out. Um, that can also be tricky if you're getting it off of a truck and setting it up and flipping it over. Uh, Tents can be tricky. Tents can be a huge variety of weights. I've and how many people are helping to set it up can make it a huge difference. And then we always have variable weather. So it could be super cold. There could be snow flying, like in November when we are at the farmer's market. It might be 100 degrees with humidity and you're in the direct sun. It might be pouring down rain or super duper windy. So it you need to be prepared for everything. We try to make sure we're prepared for everything and even have stuff for our workers, but that doesn't always work out. And then it's just a lot of standing. So you're on usually cement or um, on tarmac or something like that, a hard solid surface. Some days, like on a Saturday, we might be doing that for 16 hours. And although it doesn't sound like a lot of work, a lot of folks just can't handle that standing that long. There's not a lot of ability to sit down just because things move fast enough that you can't have anything in the way um, of trying to, help customers. So there's very rarely any kind of chair or stool or anything that you can use. So once we get to the end of the year, we have to clean up all the mess that we've been ignoring for quite a while. So things move fast during the growing season. We repair what we have to. Everything else waits. Um, we can't always get the parts either, so sometimes you have to just wait for parts. So during the winter, we repair all the tractors that are broken. We change all the oil. We repair the other things that are broken, maybe crates or storage bins or things like that. So anything that broke um, or needs to be cleaned, as we'll talk about in a second, really just kind of gets pushed to the side because we have more pressing matters to deal with. So um, as you may guess, sometimes if you let stuff go for a while, the situation, the amount of work it's going to take to clean that up or fix it is going to be greater. Maintenance and cleaning. There are a lot of uh, regulations or at least best practices around growing fresh produce for people to consume. So nobody's in the business of growing fruits and vegetables to make people sick. So in the winter is a time when people do the really thorough clean, take things apart like If they have a washer that washes vegetables, you might pull that apart to make sure it gets all clean and it isn't harboring any bacteria. Probably clean all your surfaces, your containers, everything. You really want to start fresh with everything cleaned in the spring. So there's a lot of cleaning things that happens during the winter, which can be really, really cold because if you're washing things with water in an unheated area, it can get downright cold. We clean all the production areas, get rid of all the garbage, get rid of things that are too old, try to kind of clean all of that up. Might be dealing with weeds, dealing with like trees and things that have grown that we need to get rid of in the winter because that's the only time to do it. And in some years we have to, in some years we've had enough of a problem that we've had to dig out things because there was so much erosion. So we've dug out a couple of feet of soil. We have also had the joy of cleaning the snow off of our hoop houses because the actual metal structure was buckling because of the weight of the snow. So there's not really an off season, and that was a pretty urgent process. We also use this time of the year to replace plastic and things like that if we need to. And then the other thing we do is a lot of inventory and supplies. So all the stuff that we use during the year, we have to get during the winter for the most part. So, it's everything from an oil filter to new stakes for plants, ordering all of our seeds, ordering all of our trays and soil, and trying to deal with the delivery of that kind of stuff. Another thing that we do quite a bit during the winter, um, our education and paperwork. We go to grower meetings, reading growing grower publications, online education, and then talk with seed reps and extension experts. And then there's still a ton of book work that we still have to do. So books, taxes, planning, purchasing for the next season. As of late, just making sure that you have the DOT number and all these other things has become more and more consuming. Um, and I just want to kind of mention here that you'll notice that this is like a 180-degree turnaround from what folks are used to doing. So they've gone from this highly physical, moving all the time season, and then we move into like couch potato season. So there's a lot of being indoors because you can't necessarily do the work you need to if it's too cold. A lot of it is sitting. Um, it's a very tricky thing because you kind of go into the semi hibernation period and then in the spring you have to somehow come back out and start doing highly physical tasks. So I find that this is a really tricky season for most of the growers to kind of keep going and moving in. Uh, we do have fresh market growers that do season extension things in their hoop houses and are maybe growing spinach and things like that. Um, and that makes it a little bit easier to keep moving. But it can be very difficult when you get to this point in the season and you're trying to get all your rest in from working so hard during the year, but that can kind of backfire on you when you get to spring again. So other considerations, a lot of the equipment that's being used, because specialized equipment is expensive and usually built for large production producers, like people who are doing canning and freezing um, and wholesaling. Generally, a lot of things that fresh market vegetable growers use on their jobs are repurposed from something else. So they're not created for that particular task, which causes some concerns for safety because when something isn't designed for the use you're using it for, things can happen. The other tricky thing is that sometimes the safety modifications they do on tractors or guards that they put onto different things um, end up being a hindrance. And so some people will take those off thinking that everyone has enough sense not to put their hand there. When, of course, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't think about that or it doesn't occur to. Insects and plants. I can't tell you how many times I've been stung. There's lots of stinging, biting insects out there. We're outdoors. It's hot. Um, Horse flies, the whole thing. So there's lots of insects out there. And then there are plants. A lot of the plants that we grow will give you a rash. So things like winter squash, there are certain things that aren't a problem at all to pick, and we can just go through them and it's really easy. And then other ones, um, you end up with a rash that goes from your hands all the way up your arms by the time you're done. Um, Also, another reason we encourage everybody to wear pants out in the field so that they're not getting injured that way. We're dealing with tools, knives, hose, etc. Um, you think that things like somebody standing on the end of a rake and hitting themselves in the head is just comedic, but it happens. If something's laying on the ground, it can potentially harm people. We also have a fair number of people that aren't really quite safe with their knives. We had one of the guys who was working for us who used to lose his knife. He started putting it under the truck tire, so he knew where it was. Also, not a really great idea. People riding on the backs of trucks in bins for tractors so they don't have to walk back, all sorts of stuff like that. We have re-entry intervals for pesticide safety. Sometimes it's 24 to 48 hours before you can let a worker in there. Um, but of course, a lot of these make exemptions for family members. So you can have family members go in even though it's not a safe situation. Sudden or extreme weather, lightning and thunderstorms can really come in fast. Tornado warnings, you never have enough time because you're out in a field and it's really hard to get in from a field all the way to a safe spot. Um, and a lot of times on farms, there aren't any really great safe spots from something like a tornado or, flooding. And then age. Our average age of farmers keeps getting older and older, and they just keep on doing the same things they were doing in their 20s and 30s. But they feel it a lot more. So that's one of the things that we have to take into consideration is what is the capacity for somebody's body to really do that, and what kinds of things can help to make people more able to do that kind of physical labor for a longer period of time. Because farmers just don't retire at 65. We know plenty of folks that were still farming into their 80s, and for some people, that's just an economic reality. They need to keep going because they haven't put away anything for retirement, or they need to pay bills or things like that. So it's just something that we have to figure out and keep doing. So that is the super fun world of vegetable farming. And I know you're all gonna now quit your jobs and run out and get a hoe and think, hey, this is the life, vegetable farming. I can work my butt off when it's really, really hot and carry lots of things and um, be out in the, you know, weather and things like that. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have, but fresh market vegetable farming really is a highly physical endeavor.